the private jet glistened under the late afternoon sun, a gleaming symbol of wealth and exclusivity. Inside, the cabin was a luxurious haven of plush leather seats, soft golden accents, and polished wood paneling. The air was filled with the soft hum of low conversation, a gathering of elite travelers who were used to the best of everything. This was a place where status defined who belonged and who didn't, a world where respect was expected and where appearances mattered. At the entrance of the cabin, Laura Simmons, the lead flight attendant, stood with an air of authority. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, and her platinum blonde hair was styled in an immaculate bun. Her gaze was sharp, almost piercing, as she scanned the passengers boarding the plane. She greeted each one with a practiced smile, a warm nod for the familiar faces and a polite but distant nod for the new ones. She was used to this life of impeccable service, but not everyone received the same attention. As she watched the passengers settle in, her gaze landed on Chris Johnson, a sharply dressed black man in his late 30s, moving confidently toward his seat near the front of the cabin. There was something about him that didn't sit right with Laura, a subtle shift in her demeanor as her eyes followed him. His tailored suit and confident air didn't change her initial reaction. He was out of place, she thought, not the type of person she expected to be in the section reserved for the elite. As Chris moved down the aisle, Laura stepped forward, her expression unreadable, but her tone firm. "Excuse me, sir," she said, blocking his path. "I think you're in the wrong section." Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it, as if she were certain of what she was saying. Chris paused and met her gaze with steady confidence. "No, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he replied, his voice even, betraying no sign of doubt or discomfort. Laura's smile tightened slightly, but she didn't back down. "I don't think so," she said, her voice now tinged with condescension. "This section is reserved for our VIP passengers." Chris didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or show any signs of anger. Instead, he remained calm, his deep brown eyes holding a quiet power that seemed to unsettle Laura even further. "You might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions," he said smoothly, the words carrying a quiet authority that struck a chord with Laura. But she didn't respond. Instead, she shook her head with a barely noticeable smirk. "I don't need to check anything. I know exactly who belongs here and who doesn't." The tension between them was palpable. The rest of the passengers watched, some with curiosity, others with a growing sense of discomfort. Some whispered among themselves, speculating what would happen next, while others simply observed the unfolding interaction. Chris, on the other hand, remained seated, his composure unbroken. He exuded a quiet confidence, a self-assurance that made Laura's attempts to control the situation all the more ineffective. Little did she know, her assumptions were about to cost her far more than she could imagine. The silence in the cabin grew heavier, as if the air itself was charged with electricity. Passengers shifted in their seats, exchanging curious glances as the confrontation between Chris Johnson and Laura Simmons continued. Some passengers seemed to be holding their breath, while others whispered quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation. Laura, the lead flight attendant, stood firm, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was used to being in control, and she wasn't going to let anyone, least of all someone like Chris, challenge her authority. "Sir, this is your last warning," Laura's voice grew sharper, colder, as the tension in the air seemed to make her words more biting. "If you don't move to the back of the plane, I will have to call security." The words hung in the air, and the passengers' eyes darted between the two, unsure how the situation would unfold. The cabin had quieted, and for the first time, Laura could sense the unease in the eyes of the passengers around her. Some of them were looking at Chris with curiosity, while others seemed to share a silent judgment. Despite their murmurs, Chris remained calm, his posture unyielding. Chris met Laura's gaze, his deep brown eyes steady and unbothered by her tone. "Call whoever you need to," he said, his voice calm and unwavering. "But I'm not moving." A few whispers passed through the cabin, the passengers visibly shocked by Chris's defiance. Laura's frustration was mounting. She had seen this kind of challenge before, people trying to sneak into first class or act like they belonged when they didn't. But Chris wasn't like the others. He wasn't backing down, and the more he refused to comply, the more it seemed as though she was losing control of the situation. Laura's eyes narrowed as she scanned Chris once again, looking for any sign of weakness. There was none. His calm demeanor only seemed to infuriate her further. She had expected him to apologize, to be embarrassed, but instead, he stood his ground without raising his voice or losing his composure. With her patience running thin, Laura took a step closer to Chris, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "You're causing a disturbance," she said, her voice edged with growing irritation. "This is a reserved section for our VIP passengers. It's not for people like you." Her words were harsh, and the way she said them made it clear she had already decided who belonged and who didn't. Chris's calm expression didn't falter. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, one hand resting casually on the armrest. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he replied coolly. "This is exactly where I belong." The tension in the cabin continued to rise as Laura's patience wore thinner. She had made her decision, and in her mind, there was no room for anyone to question her authority. But Chris wasn't going to make it easy for her. The quiet defiance in his voice, the calm confidence he exuded, had thrown her off balance. The passengers, once silent observers, now found themselves drawn into the drama, some watching in disbelief, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. It was clear that something had shifted. What had started as a simple interaction had now become a battle of wills. And as the tension built, no one could predict how it would end. The atmosphere in the cabin was thick with tension. Laura Simmons, the lead flight attendant, stood rigidly, her eyes locked on Chris Johnson. His calm demeanor only seemed to fuel her frustration, and the passengers around them seemed to hold their breath, sensing that something big was about to happen. The once serene ambience of the luxurious private jet had shifted, now teetering on the edge of a confrontation that was only getting worse. Laura's patience had run out. "I'll ask you one last time," she said, her voice louder now, her words laced with authority. "Move to the back of the plane, or I will have to call security." Her tone was sharp, a clear indication that she believed she was in control of the situation. Chris, however, didn't flinch. He sat back in his seat, his arms resting comfortably on the armrests, his posture unshaken. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied, his voice calm but filled with a quiet authority that only seemed to heighten the tension in the air. His deep brown eyes met Laura's gaze, unblinking, as though daring her to make the next move. The cabin was dead silent. Passengers were now leaning forward in their seats, their eyes darting between Chris and Laura, sensing that something significant was unfolding. A few exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. Laura's frustration grew as she realized that Chris wasn't the type to back down easily. "I'm not going to ask you again," Laura pressed, her voice now tinged with annoyance. "If you don't move, I'll have you removed from this flight." She took a step forward, her stance now more aggressive, clearly trying to assert her dominance. Chris's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't shown a flicker of irritation. He was unfazed by her threats. "Go ahead. Call security," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "But I assure you, it won't change anything." Laura's jaw tightened, and her eyes narrowed in disbelief. She had assumed this would be an easy confrontation, just another case of someone trying to take a seat they didn't belong in. But Chris was different. He wasn't intimidated by her, and his calm response only made her more defensive. The passengers around them were beginning to realize that the stakes were much higher than they had initially thought. Whispers spread through the cabin, as some of them leaned toward each other, quietly speculating about who Chris really was. The wealthy socialite in the corner, her pearls gleaming in the soft light, glanced at her companion and whispered, "Who does he think he is?" Chris's presence seemed to command the room, and though he had said nothing about his identity, his calm authority was unmistakable. He had built his empire through years of hard work, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals and establishing himself as a force to be reckoned with. But today, he was being judged not by his accomplishments, but by the assumptions of someone who believed they knew better. Laura's frustration continued to mount, and the situation seemed on the verge of escalating further. Chris remained composed, his eyes never leaving hers, as if waiting for her to realize the mistake she had made. It was a battle of wills now, one that would have far-reaching consequences for Laura, whether she realized it or not. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Laura Simmons, the lead flight attendant, stood frozen in her tracks. Her earlier confrontational stance had faltered, and the weight of Chris Johnson's unwavering calm was beginning to sink in. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, their once quiet whispers now growing louder as they realized this wasn't just a typical dispute. Chris, still seated, remained calm as ever. He had made it clear that he wasn't moving, that he wasn't intimidated by her threats or her authority. Laura had hoped to assert her dominance, but her sharp words hadn't fazed him. Instead, they seemed to have only sharpened his resolve. "Are you really going to continue with this?" Chris asked, his voice smooth but carrying an edge that made everyone in the cabin listen intently. His deep brown eyes never wavered as he held her gaze, the quiet power in his presence undeniable. Laura opened her mouth, about to retaliate, but she paused. Something in the air had shifted. For the first time, she felt a flicker of doubt gnawing at her. She had been so sure that this was just another instance of someone trying to sneak into first class, someone who didn't belong. But now, in front of her, sat a man who didn't need to explain himself, didn't need to justify his presence. It was clear he belonged, he just wasn't who she expected. A few of the passengers noticed the change, their curiosity piqued. The wealthy socialite, who had been the first to whisper judgment, now sat quietly, her gaze shifting between Chris and Laura, her expression no longer full of the earlier smugness. Even the businessman across the aisle, who had initially frowned at Chris's defiance, now leaned forward, sensing the growing unease in the cabin. Laura's frustration had reached its peak, but she had no idea how to recover. She had tried to exert control over a situation that she didn't fully understand. Her authority had been challenged by someone who was used to being in charge, used to commanding respect. Chris didn't play by her rules. Her voice, once sharp and demanding, had now lost some of its firmness. "If you don't move to the back of the plane, I will have no choice but to call security," she repeated, but this time, the words felt hollow, the edge gone from her tone. Chris didn't react. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved swiftly as he typed a quick message, then placed the phone back down, all while maintaining eye contact with Laura. "What are you doing?" Laura demanded, her frustration bubbling over again. Chris leaned back in his seat, his posture relaxed, yet exuding an undeniable presence. "Just making sure the right people see what's happening here," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight that made Laura hesitate for a brief moment. She scoffed, trying to brush off the tension that had gripped her. "You think this is some sort of game," she said, but her words felt less convincing now. Laura's eyes flickered nervously as the realization began to dawn on her. She was losing control of this situation, perhaps she had already lost it. What she didn't know was that her actions had already set in motion a chain of events that would shake her sense of authority to the core. Chris sat silently, letting the silence fill the cabin, his steady gaze unwavering. Laura didn't know it yet, but her mistake was about to cost her far more than just a moment of embarrassment. She was about to find out exactly who Chris Johnson was, and how deeply her assumptions had misjudged him. The atmosphere in the cabin had become charged with an electric tension, and every eye in the room seemed to be on Laura Simmons. She could feel the weight of their gaze, but it wasn't the kind of attention she was used to. It wasn't admiration or deference. It was something else, something uncomfortable. For the first time, she felt exposed, her authority questioned, and the quiet realization that she had misjudged Chris Johnson was starting to hit hard. Chris, calm and composed, had remained seated, his earlier quiet words lingering in the air. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to escalate the situation further. His presence, unwavering and confident, was enough to shift the balance in the cabin. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder as they began to understand that something much bigger was at play here. Laura took a step back, her breath uneven, her mind racing as she tried to regain her composure. She had been in control, or so she thought, but now it seemed like the situation had spiraled out of her hands. Chris was no longer just another passenger. He was a man who commanded respect, whether or not she was ready to give it. The captain, a stoic figure who had been behind the scenes until now, finally stepped into the cabin. His eyes scanned the room briefly before locking onto Laura. There was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "Miss Simmons, step aside," the captain said, his tone calm but firm. The words hit Laura like a hammer. She was being dismissed, not just as a flight attendant, but as someone who had failed in her duties. Laura blinked in surprise. "Excuse me," she stammered, her voice betraying the confusion she felt. She had expected the captain to back her up, to offer support in her standoff with Chris. Instead, his eyes softened with a trace of sympathy as he turned his attention to Chris. "Mr. Johnson, I apologize for this situation," the captain said, his respect for Chris clear in his tone. Chris didn't even flinch. His eyes met the captain's, and he nodded. "It's all right," he replied evenly, his voice as composed as it had been from the beginning. The weight of the situation started to settle in for Laura. She had assumed so much, about Chris, about his place on the plane, about who belonged and who didn't. And now, it was all unraveling before her. Her entire career was about to take a nosedive, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The passengers watched in stunned silence. Some were still processing the realization of what was happening. Others had already pieced the puzzle together. The businessman across the aisle cleared his throat, his earlier disapproval replaced by quiet understanding. The wealthy socialite, who had been whispering and making judgments just moments before, now looked at Chris with newfound respect. "Miss Simmons, we'll need to address this right away," the captain said. The sound of authority in his voice was clear. Laura's chest tightened, her heart pounding in her ears as she slowly stepped aside. She had no choice now. As she moved back, the realization hit her fully. Chris Johnson wasn't just another passenger. He was the owner of the jet, the one person she had thought didn't belong here. The truth struck her with the force of a revelation. Her world, once so controlled, was suddenly turned upside down. Her mouth went dry as the captain made it clear. Chris wasn't just a random traveler, he was someone far more powerful than she had imagined. And she had just crossed the line in the worst way possible. The passengers' quiet murmurs grew into hushed whispers, and Laura felt every pair of eyes on her. She had made a mistake. A huge one. And now, it was too late to take it back. As the captain addressed the situation, Laura Simmons felt the full weight of her mistake pressing down on her shoulders. Her once perfect world of control was quickly disintegrating in front of her. Every passenger in the cabin was watching, their eyes flicking between her and Chris Johnson. The silence was deafening, and Laura could feel the tension in the air, thick with anticipation. Chris, as calm as ever, hadn't budged from his seat. His earlier confidence now seemed like an unshakable force, and it was clear that he wasn't rattled by the growing drama unfolding around him. He had endured a moment of judgment, but rather than retaliating with anger or pride, he had simply stayed true to himself, unwavering in his belief that he belonged there. Laura, on the other hand, had underestimated him, and now, she was paying the price. The captain's words echoed in her ears. Mr. Johnson is not just a passenger here. He is the owner of this jet. Her stomach churned as the truth sank in. She stood frozen for a moment, unable to react, as the full extent of her blunder settled in. The realization that she had not only judged Chris unfairly but had also humiliated him in front of others made her flush with embarrassment. She had assumed that someone like Chris, well-dressed but not in the same mold as the typical elite passengers, didn't belong in first class. Her eyes had immediately categorized him as out of place, and in doing so, she had lost everything. The passengers, once watching with curiosity, now exchanged glances of disbelief and sympathy. Some of them couldn't help but whisper to one another, realizing that they had also made assumptions about Chris, just as Laura had. The businessman across the aisle, who had quietly observed the entire exchange, now looked at her with a knowing glance. A soft chuckle escaped him, though it wasn't out of malice, it was more out of understanding. Grace, the junior flight attendant, had been standing awkwardly near the galley. She had been witness to the entire incident, torn between doing what was right and maintaining her loyalty to the team. Now, seeing Laura's faltering stance and the respect Chris had commanded, Grace felt a wave of relief. But it wasn't just relief, there was a part of her that felt vindicated. The power imbalance had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Chris finally broke the silence, his deep voice carrying a quiet authority. "I think we're done here," he said, leaning back into his seat and crossing his legs in a deliberate motion. The subtle movement was almost imperceptible, but it sent a ripple through the cabin. Laura stood motionless, unsure of what to do next. She had lost control of the situation and now she was the one under judgment. The captain, now with a calm but firm demeanor, turned to Laura. "Miss Simmons, I need you to come with us." "You're not needed here anymore," he said, his voice final. The words hit Laura like a cold slap. She had never imagined this scenario playing out like this. The captain, once an ally, now seemed like a stranger to her. He was making it clear that she had violated the most basic principle of her job, respecting all passengers, regardless of who they were. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. but there was nothing she could say. There was nothing left to defend herself. The judgment had been passed, and there was no going back. Two uniformed officers appeared at the entrance of the cabin. The sound of their boots on the floor echoed through the silent space. As they moved toward her, Laura felt her legs go weak. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Miss Simmons," one of the officers said, his voice stern. "Please come with us." Laura's breath caught in her throat as she turned to Chris, her face pale. "Please," she whispered, almost pleading. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know who you were." Chris didn't react immediately. He simply watched her with calm, steady eyes. His lips curled into a slight, knowing smile, but there was no malice in it. "That's the problem," he said quietly. "You didn't bother to know." The officers moved toward her, and Laura felt the sting of her humiliation deepen. This was it, the fall from grace she had never expected. The passengers, who had been eager to see how this would unfold, now seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats, a few of them shaking their heads as Laura was escorted off the plane. As the officers led her away, the last thing Laura heard was Chris's voice, steady and clear. "Respect isn't just something you give when you feel like it," he said. "It's something everyone deserves." The words lingered in the air long after she had disappeared down the aisle. As Laura Simmons disappeared down the aisle, escorted by the officers, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. What had been a tense moment of drama had transformed into something more profound, a moment of realization for everyone who had witnessed it. Passengers who had once leaned toward gossip now sat back in their seats, contemplative, while others exchanged meaningful glances. The cabin, which had once hummed with whispers of judgment and curiosity, now buzzed with a different energy: respect. Chris Robinson, still seated in his spot in the first-class section, appeared unbothered by the turn of events. His suit, though dampened by the spilled water, seemed to hold a quiet authority that no one could ignore. He had entered the plane as just another passenger, but now, he was something far greater in their eyes, a figure who had demanded respect without ever needing to raise his voice. He had stood firm, unwavering in his resolve, and it had made all the difference. As Chris adjusted his blazer and leaned back in his seat, the ripple effect of his calm authority began to make its way through the cabin. Some passengers, including the businessman across the aisle, who had been silently observing, nodded approvingly in his direction. A few even exchanged words with him, their tone respectful, as if acknowledging the silent strength he had displayed. The wealthy socialite, who had whispered judgmental comments earlier, now sat with her pearls tightly clasped, her expression no longer one of disdain but one of curiosity. Chris had unwittingly turned the tables, his actions had forced them all to examine their biases and question their assumptions. Grace, the young flight attendant who had remained silent throughout the ordeal, couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and admiration. She had been caught between her duties and her sense of right, unsure of whether to stand with her colleague or to do what she knew was the right thing. Seeing Chris stand firm, despite the unfair treatment he had received, gave her a sense of clarity. She wasn't alone in recognizing the injustice that had occurred, and now, more than ever, she felt that it was her duty to be a part of the solution. As the plane resumed its course, the once dominant tension began to dissolve, leaving behind a quiet, almost reverent atmosphere. The passengers' discomfort with the situation had waned, replaced by a shared understanding that something had shifted, not just in how they saw Chris, but in how they now saw themselves. The cabin was no longer just a place for elite travelers. It had become a space for reflection and growth. The captain, who had been the one to finally address the issue with authority, moved through the cabin once more, his face composed but with an air of apology. As he passed by Chris, he gave him a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of the respect that Chris had not only earned but demanded in a way that was impossible to ignore. "Mr. Robinson, I hope this experience doesn't overshadow your journey," the captain said softly, his voice carrying genuine respect. Chris merely smiled, his response simple but meaningful: "It won't." By the time the flight landed, the impact of the day's events had lingered with the passengers, each of them silently reflecting on what had transpired. As they exited the plane, the socialite, who had once looked down on Chris, now approached him with an unexpected smile. "Mr. Robinson," she said, her voice kinder than before, "thank you for your patience and for showing us what it means to stand your ground." Chris nodded, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He didn't need to say much, his actions had already spoken volumes. The passengers had learned a powerful lesson, one that would stay with them far beyond this flight. In the end, Chris had not only secured his place on the plane, he had also left a lasting mark on everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. Respect, he had shown, wasn't something that could be given only to the privileged. It was a right that every individual deserved, regardless of appearance, status, or assumptions. And for the passengers aboard this flight, it was a lesson they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. As the plane descended toward its destination, a sense of calm filled the cabin, a stark contrast to the tension that had earlier gripped the air. The incident involving Chris Robinson and Laura Simmons had shaken everyone aboard, but it had also transformed the atmosphere. What had started as an uncomfortable confrontation had ended in a lesson, one that had altered the perceptions of those who had witnessed it. Chris, the man who had been unjustly judged and humiliated, had become a symbol of strength and dignity. Chris sat in his seat, his back straight, his gaze steady as the plane touched down. The events of the flight had unfolded in a way that most passengers would never forget, and for Chris, they had reaffirmed his belief in standing up for what was right. Despite the unfair treatment he had endured, he had remained calm, composed, and resolute. It wasn't about proving others wrong, it was about demanding respect through actions, not words. As the plane taxied to the gate, Chris noticed the shift in the passengers around him. The businessmen who had previously been disinterested now looked at him with newfound respect, offering a subtle nod as they made eye contact. The socialite, who had once whispered behind her pearls, now smiled warmly at Chris, her judgment replaced by an understanding of his silent strength. Even Grace, the junior flight attendant who had been caught in the middle, gave Chris a respectful glance, her earlier hesitation replaced by admiration. The passengers began to gather their belongings, their conversations softer now, a mix of quiet reflections and murmurs of approval. Chris remained seated for a moment, his mind clear and focused. He had known all along that the flight was just a means to an end, a journey to a new chapter in his life, both professionally and personally. The encounter with Laura, though unexpected, had served as a powerful reminder that standing up for one's dignity was always worth the challenge. As the passengers disembarked, the captain approached Chris once more, this time with a genuine smile on his face. "Mr. Robinson, it was a pleasure having you on board," he said, his voice warm but respectful. "I want to apologize again for the situation. I hope your experience didn't leave a bad impression." Chris nodded, offering a gracious smile in return. "No need for apologies, Captain," he replied calmly. "It's all part of the journey. Sometimes, we just need to remember that respect is earned, not assumed." The captain's expression softened, and he gave Chris a respectful nod before stepping back to greet other passengers. As Chris stood up, ready to exit the plane, Grace approached him, her eyes filled with gratitude and respect. "Mr. Robinson, I just wanted to say, "Thank you for handling that situation the way you did," she said, her voice sincere. "I've learned a lot from you today." Chris looked at her, his expression warm but measured. "It wasn't about me, Grace," he said kindly. "It was about making sure that everyone knows their worth, regardless of how they're treated. You did the right thing, and that's what matters." Grace smiled, her eyes shining with newfound confidence. "Thank you," she said quietly before stepping aside to let Chris exit the plane. As Chris walked through the terminal, he could feel the weight of the day's events lift from his shoulders. He had faced adversity head-on, and in doing so, had not only stood up for himself but had also created a ripple effect of change. The lessons learned aboard that private jet would continue to echo, not just among the passengers, but also in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed the events unfold. For Chris, it was just another chapter in his journey, one where respect, dignity, and strength had led the way. And as he stepped into the bright, bustling world beyond the airport, he knew that this experience had only strengthened his resolve to continue leading with integrity, no matter the challenges ahead. As Chris Robinson walked out of the airport, the events from the flight lingered in his mind, but the weight of the situation no longer felt heavy. Instead, there was a sense of peace that had settled in his chest. He had stood firm, faced judgment, and remained composed, and now he was seeing the aftereffects of his quiet strength. What had started as a small act of defiance against an unfair situation had now turned into something much larger, a ripple of change that was slowly sweeping through the lives of those who had witnessed it. The story of Chris's experience aboard the jet had spread quickly. By the time he had landed, social media had exploded with discussions about what had transpired. People from all walks of life shared their thoughts, some in support of Chris, while others expressed their disbelief at the way he had been treated. The hashtag respect over assumptions began trending, as people rallied around the idea that respect should be earned through actions, not preconceived notions or superficial judgments. Chris's phone buzzed with messages, some from old colleagues, others from new acquaintances. Most of them were messages of support, praising his calm demeanor and dignified response. One message stood out, however. It was from Grace, the junior flight attendant who had witnessed the entire ordeal. She had sent a simple but powerful text: "You've changed my perspective. Thank you for standing up for what's right. I won't forget it." It was a small message, but to Chris, it meant the world. Grace had been one of the people caught in the middle of the tension during the flight, unsure of how to react. But now, she had seen firsthand how important it was to stand up for dignity, no matter the situation. Her message was a reminder of the impact one person's actions could have on others, even in moments that seemed small or insignificant. As Chris made his way to a waiting car, he reflected on the fact that it wasn't just about him anymore. It had never been about him, really. It had always been about changing the way people viewed others based on assumptions and superficial judgments. He had always known that strength didn't need to be loud or forceful. Sometimes, strength was in the quiet defiance, in the calm assurance that you were worthy of respect, no matter what anyone else thought. Back at the airport, Laura Simmons, the flight attendant who had confronted Chris, was facing the consequences of her actions. Her superiors had been made aware of the incident, and it didn't take long for them to reach the same conclusion that Chris had already known: her behavior was unacceptable. In a meeting with her manager, Laura was informed that her actions had been reported, and a formal review of the situation was underway. The captain, who had immediately stood up for Chris, had already spoken with the higher-ups, making it clear that the flight attendant's actions were not only unjust but also damaging to the reputation of the airline. As for Grace, the young flight attendant who had been caught between the two conflicting sides, She was offered a position of responsibility in the company's new customer service initiative. She had earned the respect of her colleagues for stepping up when it mattered most, and the company wanted to reward her for her integrity. It was a new beginning for her, one where she could continue to grow as a professional and as a person. The ripple effect of Chris's actions was just beginning. It wasn't a loud revolution, but a quiet wave of change that was washing over the airline and beyond. The passengers on that plane, many of whom had initially judged Chris, had left the flight with a new sense of awareness. They had learned a valuable lesson that day, one that would stay with them for years to come. As Chris climbed into the car, he glanced at the city skyline in the distance, knowing that this moment, though seemingly small in the grand scheme of things, had made a difference. He wasn't a superhero or a world leader, but he had been a catalyst for change. And sometimes, that's all it takes, one person, standing up for what's right, to make a lasting impact on the world around them. The key lesson from this story is the power of standing firm in your dignity and self-worth, even in the face of unfair judgment. In life, it's easy to fall into the trap of allowing others' assumptions about us, based on appearance, background, or status, to shape how we see ourselves. However, true strength comes from within. Just like Chris, who faced unjust treatment but remained calm and confident, we can choose to respond with grace and authority, showing others that respect should be earned through actions, not assumptions. Life isn't always fair, but how we handle these situations can set an example for others and create ripple effects of change. Whether in the workplace, social settings, or even within our families, standing up for what's right, treating others with dignity, and staying true to ourselves can leave lasting impacts. Never underestimate the power of your actions, as they might inspire others to reflect on their own judgments and biases. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell for more inspiring content. Your support means the world to me, and together, we can continue spreading positivity and life lessons. Thank you for being part of this journey.